I know you've already outlined some aspects of what's being described as the emerging Biden doctrine. What are the biggest differences from your perspective between the Trump and Biden doctrines when it comes to foreign policy?
Well, first, it's great to see you, and it's great to be with you today. Thanks for having me. Look, I think when the president's looking at this, two basic conclusions. First, the world doesn't organize itself. So if we're not in there and present every single day trying to do some of that organizing, helping to write the rules and shape the norms that sort of govern the way countries relate to each other, then either someone else is going to do it in our place, or maybe just as bad, no one does it, and then you have chaos. Either way, not good for America. So part one is showing up, being engaged. Part two is this. None of the big problems that we face and that are actually going to affect the lives of the American people every single day, whether it's climate, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's the spread of bad weapons, not a single one can be addressed by any one country acting alone, even one as powerful as the United States. So there's a premium on cooperation, and so a premium on diplomacy, because how do we get that cooperation from other countries? It starts with our diplomacy.
Let's talk about some specific issues. Russia first. President Biden is warning that he won't, in his words, hesitate to raise the cost on Russia. But so far, the Biden administration hasn't offered any specifics. What does that cost, from your perspective, look like?
Well, first, I think when it comes to Mr. Navalny, the fact that Russia feels compelled, that Mr. Putin feels compelled to try to silence one voice speaks volumes about how important that voice is and how it's representative of so many millions of Russians who want to be heard and who are fed up with the corruption and with the kleptocracy. But what we're doing is, first of all, consulting and working closely with other countries who are very concerned about what's happened, not just to Mr. Navalny, but others who have stood up to exercise their rights. But second, Wolf, as you know, it seems apparent that a chemical weapon was used to try to kill Mr. Navalny. That violates the Chemical Weapons Convention and other obligations that Russia has. It violates clear sanctions that Congress has. We're reviewing that. We're looking at that very carefully. And when we have the results, we'll take action in the appropriate way.
And then you'll spell it out at that time. Do the protests in support of the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, from your perspective, signal vulnerability in Putin when it comes to Putin's grip on the country?
I think it spells a deep dissatisfaction with, as I said, the corruption that is rampant, the kleptocracy that dominates the government. And it just speaks to the fact that Russians are looking for ways to make sure that their voice is heard. And the system as it's currently constituted doesn't exactly favor that. So, look, this is fundamentally about Russia, the Russian people, their future. It's not about us. And I think the Russian government would make a mistake in attributing to outside actors, whether it's the United States, European partners, and others, responsibility for what's happening. This is fundamentally about Russia, about Russia's future, and hopefully about a more democratic system going forward.
You're facing a stalemate, apparently, when it comes to Iran, the Iran nuclear deal. Iran's Ayatollah says the U.S. needs to lift sanctions before it returns to the deal. President Biden says he won't lift sanctions first. So what happens now?
Well, look, the president's been very clear about this. If Iran returns to compliance with its obligations under the nuclear agreement, we would do the same thing, and then we would work with our allies and partners to try to build a longer and stronger agreement, and also bring in some of these other issues, like Iran's missile program, like its destabilizing actions in the region that need to be addressed as well. The problem we face now, Wolf, is that in recent months, Iran has lifted one restraint after another. They were being held in check by the agreement. We got out of the agreement. Iran started to lift the various restraints in the agreement, and the result is they are closer than they've been to having the capacity on short order to produce fissile material for a nuclear weapon. The agreement had pushed that past a year. According to public reports now, it's down to 3 or 4 months and heading in the wrong direction. So the first thing that's so critical is for Iran to come back into compliance with its obligations. There are ways from that. But if they do that, the path of diplomacy is there, and we're willing to walk it.
So they got to take the first step, and then the U.S. will respond. Is that right?
The president's been clear about that. They need to come back into compliance, and if they do, we will look to do the same thing.
Let's get to some other sensitive issues. President Biden is ending U.S. military support for Saudi and Emirati offensive operations in Yemen, pausing arms sales to those countries. Does President Biden intend to substantially change the U.S.-Saudi relationship?
Well, first, on Yemen itself, Wolf, three things are critical. One, we are ending our support for the military campaign led by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. Second, as we're doing that, we're also deeply committed to the defense of Saudi Arabia, aggression directed at it from the Houthis. So those 2 points are very critical. The third point, though, is equally important. Even as we are getting out of supporting the military campaign, we're leaning into playing a leading role and an active role in the diplomacy to try to actually end the war. The President, through the State Department, appointed a senior special envoy to deal with Yemen, and he's now engaged and acting. We need to lean into this. This is, by most accounts, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and that's saying something right now. Millions of people living in very, very desperate situation. Ending the war is the critical thing to actually improving their lot and their situation.
Yeah, it certainly is an awful situation. A State Department spokesperson has given the Trump administration credit for what's called the Abraham Accords, the normalization deals that Israel worked out thanks to the Trump administration with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. But at the same time, you're saying it can't be a substitute for Israeli-Palestinian peace. So how exactly are you going to revive the Israeli-Palestinian peace process?
Well, first of all, yes, we applauded the Abraham Accords. This is an important step forward. Whenever we see Israel and its neighbors normalizing relations, improving relations, that's good for Israel. It's good for the other countries in question. It's good for overall peace and security. And I think it offers new prospects to people throughout the region, through travel, through trade, through other work that they can do together, to actually materially improve their lives. So that's a good thing. But as you said rightly, that doesn't mean that the challenges of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians go away. They don't. They're still there. They're not going to miraculously disappear. And so we need to engage on that. But in the first instance, the parties in question need to engage on that. Look, the hard truth is we are a long way, I think, from seeing peace break out and seeing a final resolution of the problems between Israel and the Palestinians and the creation of a Palestinian state. In the first instance now, it's do no harm. We're looking to make sure that neither side takes unilateral actions that make the prospects for moving toward peace and a resolution even more challenging than they already are. And then, hopefully, we'll see both sides take steps that create a better environment in which actual negotiations can take place.
I know that the Biden administration, still supports what's called a two-state solution,
right.
Israel, a new state of Palestine. But I understand that President Biden still hasn't even spoken with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Is that right?
Well, they spoke actually during the transition. I think one of the first calls that the president had was with the Prime Minister. I've talked to my Israeli counterparts on multiple occasions already, and you're exactly right about the two-state solution. The president strongly supports it. It is the only way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state, and the only way to give the Palestinians the state to which they're entitled.
But is there a reason, as president, he still hasn't spoken with Netanyahu? He's spoken with so many other world leaders.
Oh, I'm sure that they'll have occasion to speak, in the near future.
Anxious to get your yes or no on some specific, very sensitive issues. You've said the United States will keep the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. It used to be in Tel Aviv. Do you regard Jerusalem as Israel's capital?
I do, yes. And more importantly, we do.
As part of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, would you support Palestine having its capital in East Jerusalem?
Look, what we have to see happen is for the parties to get together directly and negotiate these so-called final status issues. That's the objective. And as I said, we're unfortunately a ways away from that at this point in time. The
Trump administration, as you know, also recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which Israel captured from Syria back in 1967. Will your administration, the Biden administration, continue to see the Golan Heights as part of Israel?
Look, leaving aside the legalities of that question, as a practical matter, the Golan is very important to Israel's security. As long as Assad is in power in Syria, as long as Iran is present in Syria, militia groups backed by Iran, the Assad regime itself, all of these pose a significant security threat to Israel. And as a practical matter, the control of the Golan in that situation, I think, remains of real importance to Israel's security. Legal questions are something else, and over time, if the situation were to change in Syria, that's something we look at. But we are nowhere near as that.